Chapter 1: The Birth of a Monster. The year is 1581. To understand the terror that gripped the Holy Roman Empire, we must travel back even further, into the cold, damp decades that birthed a monster. Imagine, if you can, a Europe that is unrecognizable to the modern mind. This was a world where the map was a jagged glass mosaic of tiny states, dukedoms, prince-bishoprics, and free imperial cities, all vying for power. There was no central police force, no forensic science, and no way for a town in the north to know what was happening in a village in the south. Between these small pockets of civilization lay the great wilderness. The forests of the 16th century were not the managed parks we see today. They were ancient, primordial, and suffocating. They were places where the sun struggled to reach the forest floor, where the paths were swallowed by mud, and where a person could disappear and never be found. In this era, life was cheap, and death was an intimate neighbor. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the religious unity of the continent, leading to decades of sporadic, brutal warfare. It was into this world of chaos that Peter Niers was born. We know little of his childhood, but records suggest he began his life as a simple shepherd in the Upper Palatinate. Think about that existence for a moment. A shepherd in the 1500s lived a life of profound isolation. He spent weeks, sometimes months, alone in the high pastures or the deep woods. He watched the stars. He listened to the wind. He learned the secrets of the terrain, the hidden caves, the ravines that the locals avoided, and the way a human voice carries across a valley. This isolation likely planted the first seeds of a detached, cold perspective on humanity. To a shepherd, sheep are resources to be managed, sheared, or slaughtered. It wouldn't be long before Peter Niers began to view humans in exactly the same way. The transition from shepherd to soldier was a common one during this period. When the recruiters for the Landsknecht arrived in the villages, they brought with them the promise of coin, colorful clothes, and a life away from the muck of the farm. The Landsknecht were the most feared mercenaries in Europe. They were famous for their flamboyant slash and puff outfits, gaudy silks and velvets that were intentionally torn to show off contrasting colors beneath. They were a law unto themselves. To be a Landsknecht was to be an outsider. They had their own courts, their own customs, and a reputation for extreme violence. Peter Niers traded his crook for a pike. He learned how to march in tight formations, how to use a dagger in the dark, and how to survive on the spoils of war. In the mercenary camps, Niers was exposed to a culture where pillaging was not just a side effect of war, but a primary goal. He saw villages burned to the ground. He saw the way civilians were treated as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. It was a masterclass in dehumanization. But while most soldiers spent their pay on ale and dice, Niers was beginning to cultivate a darker interest. In the flickering firelight of the camps, soldiers told stories of the occult. They spoke of the Black Book, of pacts with the devil, and of the hidden powers found in the bodies of the dead. Niers listened. He began to believe that the reason he had survived so many battles wasn't just luck or skill. It was because he was destined for something greater, something darker. As we dive deeper into the shadows of the Black Forest, to uncover how one man evaded the law for 9 years, I have a small favor to ask. If you're finding this investigation into history's darkest corners compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me dig up these forgotten cases and keep the lights on while we explore the dark. Now, let's get back to the trail of the butcher. By the early 1570s, Niers had left the formal military life behind, but he did not leave the violence. He became a freebooter, a bandit who moved through the Pfalz region with a small, devoted band of killers. His mentor during this time was a man named Martin Stier. Stier was a charismatic rogue who claimed to have discovered the secrets of invisibility. He taught Niers that the law of man meant nothing if you could master the laws of the supernatural. Together, they turned banditry into a ritual. They didn't just rob travelers. They began a systematic campaign of murder. Think about the psychological impact on the German countryside during these years. In a world without telephones or newspapers, news traveled by word of mouth, often becoming distorted into terrifying legends. People began to speak of a ghost gang that could strike anywhere. One day, a merchant would be found dead on the road to Nuremberg, his throat cut with surgical precision and his purse untouched. The next, a farmhouse would be found empty, the dinner still on the table, but the inhabitants gone without a trace. This was the beginning of the tally. One by one, the numbers grew. But the authorities were looking for a gang of 50 men, not realizing that the true threat was a man who knew how to hide in plain sight. Chapter 2. The Art of the Invisible Kill. Niers was no longer just a bandit. He was becoming a predator of a different order. To understand how he successfully evaded the law while his body count climbed into the hundreds, we have to look at his terrifyingly efficient methods. He utilized a combination of military tactics and psychological warfare that was centuries ahead of its time. In the 1570s, the concept of a serial killer didn't exist in the public lexicon. People understood murder as a result of a brawl, a robbery, or a blood feud. They didn't understand a man who killed for the sake of killing or for the sake of a dark religious ideology. This confusion was Peter Niers' greatest weapon. His tactical brilliance began with the terrain. As a former shepherd, Niers understood that the forest wasn't just a place to hide, it was a sensory environment. He knew how to move through the thickest undergrowth without snapping a twig. He knew that if he stayed downwind of a trail, the horses of the travelers wouldn't catch his scent. He perfected what he called the still hunt. He would identify a choke point, a place on a road where a river crossing, a steep hill, or a narrow pass forced travelers to slow down and focus on their footing. He would sit in silence for hours, sometimes days, watching the rhythm of the road. When Niers struck, he did so with the explosive violence of a landsknecht. He didn't use noisy firearms that would echo through the valley and alert the local watch. He used the steel. He preferred a long, slender dagger known as a misericord or a mercy killer. It was designed to slip through the gaps in armor, but in the hands of Niers, it was a tool for silent, clinical execution. He would strike the throat or the base of the skull, ensuring that his victims couldn't even manage a final cry for help. Within seconds, a traveling party could be wiped out, their bodies dragged into the brush before the dust from their horses had even settled. But the most chilling aspect of Niers' methodology wasn't his speed. It was his obsession with physical alchemy. As he drifted further into madness, he became convinced that he could transcend the human form. He began to hunt for specific ingredients for his rituals. In the dark folklore of the Rhine and the Danube, there was a belief in the hand of glory. Traditionally, this was the dried and pickled hand of a hanged man, used by thieves to put a household into a magical sleep. Niers, however, believed in a much more gruesome variation. He believed that the fat of an unborn child was the most potent magical substance on earth. He began to target pregnant women with a horrifying, singular focus. This wasn't merely about the act of killing, it was a harvest. In his later confession, he would describe the process with a detached, cold detail that left the court officials physically ill. He believed that by consuming the hearts of these infants and using their remains to create candles, he was weaving a suit of spiritual armor around himself. He believed he was literally becoming invisible to the common eye. This delusion was so strong that it removed his fear of the law. He would sometimes walk through a crowded marketplace in broad daylight, clutching a charm in his pocket, truly believing that no one could see him. This psychological state made him incredibly dangerous. Because he believed he was untouchable, he took risks that a sane man wouldn't dream of. He would enter taverns where "wanted" posters with his description were nailed to the wall. He would sit in the shadows, drinking ale and listening to the townspeople talk about the demon of the woods. He fed on their fear. To Niers, their terror was proof that his magic was working. He wasn't just a killer. He was a god who walked among sheep, deciding who lived and who died based on a whim or a need for a new ritual component. Between 1577 and 1580, Niers moved his hunting grounds constantly. He would kill 10 people in the Pfalz, then disappear and reappear weeks later in Bavaria, hundreds of miles away. This mobility was key. In an era where news traveled at the speed of a horse, he was always 10 steps ahead of the rumors. He used a variety of disguises: a wounded veteran of the wars, a humble monk on a pilgrimage, or a simple charcoal burner. He had a different name for every town and a different story for every innkeeper. By the time the body count passed 300, the authorities began to realize they weren't dealing with a gang of bandits, but with a singular, roaming nightmare. The prince-bishops issued a coordinated decree, offering a reward of gold that could buy a small village for the head of Peter Niers. But how do you catch a man who knows every cave and every deer trail in the empire? How do you catch a man who believes he is a ghost? Niers' arrogance was growing. He was no longer just killing for his rituals. He was killing to sustain the legend. He began to leave signatures, ritualistic arrangements of bodies that were designed to shock and terrify those who found them. He was a master of horror, and the entire heart of Europe was his stage. Chapter 3: The Ghost of Gersbach and the Rising Tide. By 1577, the name Peter Niers was already beginning to appear in the official bells, or crime chronicles of the regional courts, though he remained a shapeless phantom. It was in this year that the law finally caught a glimpse of the man behind the myth, and for a brief moment, it seemed the terror might end. In the small town of Gersbach, Niers was apprehended alongside several associates of the old Stier gang. This wasn't the result of a brilliant investigation, but rather a moment of exhaustion. Niers had been caught in a dragnet designed to clear the roads of vagrants and masterless men. The authorities in Gersbach did not know they had the Black Forest Butcher in their cells. They knew only that they had a scarred, limping mercenary who refused to give a straight answer about his origins. However, the 16th century legal system had a brutal way of finding the truth. The peinliche Fragestellung, or the questioning under pain. Niers was led to the torture chamber. Under the crushing weight of the rack and the searing heat of the iron, his iron will finally buckled. He confessed. He told them he had killed 75 people. He told them of the rituals, the blood, and the bags of remains. The officials were horrified. A confession of 75 murders was virtually unheard of. In an era where justice was public and theatrical, Niers was sentenced to a death that would match the scale of his sins. But then, something happened that solidified his legend as a supernatural entity. On the eve of his execution, while locked in a high-security stone cell, Peter Niers vanished. The official records are frustratingly vague on how he achieved this. Some say he used his hand of glory to put the guards into a trance. Others, more skeptically, suggest that even in 1577, a bag of stolen gold could open more doors than any magic spell. Regardless of the method, when the executioner arrived at the cell the next morning, the man who had confessed to 75 murders was gone. This escape was the catalyst for the mass hysteria that followed. If a man could confess to such atrocities and then simply walk through stone walls, he wasn't just a criminal. He was a servant of the abyss. Between 1577 and 1581, the murders didn't just resume, they intensified. Niers seemed to be punishing the world for his capture. He moved deeper into the Danube region, and the body count began to climb toward the terrifying final tally of 520. It was during these 4 years that the German countryside transformed into a landscape of total paranoia. The panic was so absolute that it triggered what historians call social contagion. Villages began to form holy watch groups. Travelers were forced to undergo tests to prove they weren't the butcher in disguise. People were arrested for having a limp, for having a scar, or simply for being a stranger in a town that didn't recognize them. Niers leaned into the madness. He began to leave signatures that were designed to fuel the supernatural legends. He would leave a single infant's shoe in the middle of a road, or arrange the clothing of his victims in a circle around a charred stump. He was playing a game with the collective psyche of the empire. He knew that if the people believed he was a demon, they would be too paralyzed by fear to fight back. He was right. For years, the mere rumor that Peter Niers was in a particular forest was enough to shut down trade for weeks. But while the peasants looked for a demon, the prince-bishops and the lords were beginning to realize that they were dealing with a human being. A human being who needed to eat, sleep, and wash. The wanted posters grew more descriptive. They noted his distinctive military bearing, his deep, gravelly voice, and the fact that he was almost always carrying a heavy leather satchel that he guarded with his life. The authorities began to focus not on the woods, but on the places where a weary traveler might seek refuge: the inns and the public bathhouses. By late 1581, Niers was no longer the young, agile shepherd soldier he had once been. Nearly a decade of living in damp caves and sleeping on the forest floor had taken its toll. His old wounds from the wars, and perhaps from the rack in Gersbach, were aching in the autumn chill. He needed a place to rest. He needed the warmth of a fire and the comfort of a hot bath. He turned his eyes toward the town of Neumarkt. He didn't know it, but Neumarkt had been preparing for him. The town was a hub of trade, and the local innkeepers had been quietly briefed by the constabulary. They were told to look for a man who didn't fit, a man who carried a weight in his eyes and a secret in his bag. The stage was being set for the final act of the most prolific crime spree in history. Chapter 4: The Bells of Neumarkt and the Bag of Horrors. In September of 1581, the air in the Upper Palatinate had turned crisp with the coming of autumn. The leaves of the Black Forest were shifting from deep greens to the colors of rust and dried blood. For Peter Niers, the change in season was more than a calendar shift. It was a physical burden. Nearly a decade of living as a ghost, sleeping on damp earth, hiding in limestone caves, and surviving on the adrenaline of the hunt, had finally begun to erode his iron constitution. His joints ached with the dampness of the Danube, and the limp he had carried since his mercenary days was becoming a staggering gait. Niers decided he needed the comforts of civilization. He turned his path toward the town of Neumarkt, a bustling hub of trade and transit. He believed that his magic, the charms and rituals he had performed for years, made him invisible to the suspicions of common men. He walked through the town gates not as a cowering criminal, but with the arrogant stride of a man who believed he was a god in disguise. He was dressed in the travel-worn but sturdy clothes of a veteran soldier, carrying a heavy, oilskin leather satchel that never left his side. He sought out a local establishment known as the Bells. In the 16th century, an inn was more than just a place to sleep. It was the heart of the community, a place where news was traded as often as coin. The innkeeper, a man named Fonsteel, was a shrewd observer of human nature. He had seen thousands of travelers pass through his doors, but there was something about this newcomer that set his teeth on edge. The man's eyes were too alert, shifting constantly like those of a cornered wolf, and he clutched his leather bag with a white-knuckled intensity that suggested it contained either a king's ransom or a deadly secret. Niers, feeling the weight of the road in his bones, made a request that was common for soldiers and travelers of the era. He wanted to visit the local public bathhouse. In the 1500s, bathhouses were social centers where men could wash away the filth of travel, receive a shave, and perhaps even a basic medical treatment from a barber surgeon. But Niers made a fatal error, a mistake born of 10 years of getting away with murder. He approached Fonsteel and asked him to guard his satchel while he was at the baths. The moment Niers stepped out of the inn and toward the steam-filled rooms of the bathhouse, curiosity overcame Fonsteel. The bag was unnaturally heavy for its size, and as it sat on the wooden counter, It emitted a faint, cloying scent, a smell that Fonsteel, who had seen his share of slaughtering days on the farm, recognized as the scent of old, dried blood and copper. He called over several of the town's prominent citizens and the local watchmen. With trembling hands, they pried open the heavy iron buckles of the bag. What they found inside was not gold, nor was it the silk finery of a merchant. It was a museum of the macabre. They pulled out dried, salted hearts, no larger than a man's thumb. They found the severed hands of infants, preserved in wax and wrapped in strips of human skin. There were occult symbols carved into pieces of bone, and jars of rendered fat that Niers believed granted him the power of invisibility. The room fell into a suffocating silence. The Black Forest Butcher wasn't a legend or a demon. He was a man, and he was currently sitting, unarmed and naked, in the town's bathhouse just a few streets away. The reaction was not one of orderly law enforcement, but of primal, collective rage. Word spread through the streets of Newmarket with the speed of a gale. This was the man who had stolen their daughters, murdered their wives, and turned their forests into a graveyard. A mob formed, not a chaotic swarm, but a grim, determined phalanx of townspeople armed with pitchforks, clubs, and daggers. At the bathhouse, Peter Niers was submerged in the hot water, finally allowing his guard to drop. For the first time in 9 years, he felt truly relaxed. He didn't hear the heavy boots on the cobblestones outside. He didn't hear the shouting until the doors were kicked off their hinges. He looked up, steam rising from his scarred chest, to see a wall of vengeful faces. He lunged for his clothes, reaching for the dagger he usually kept hidden in his belt, but he was too slow. The invisible man was dragged from the water, shivering and exposed. He was beaten down, bound in heavy iron chains, and hauled through the streets toward the town's deepest dungeon. The spell was broken. The god of the woods was now a prisoner in a stone cell, and the people of Newmarket were finally looking into the face of the man who had claimed 520 lives. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 5. The Chamber of Truth and the Tally of Death. Peter Niers lay in the darkness of the Neumarkt dungeon, the heavy iron shackles biting into his wrists and ankles. For nearly a decade, he had been the master of his own fate, a predator who decided the moment of every encounter. Now, the roles were reversed. He was the prey, and the town of Neumarkt was a collective hunter that would not let him go. The authorities knew that simply hanging the man would not be enough. They needed the truth. They needed to know where the bodies were buried, how he had operated for so long, and most importantly, how many lives he had actually taken. The interrogation began under the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, the legal code of the Holy Roman Empire. This code allowed for 3 degrees of torture to extract a confession. On the first day, Niers was merely shown the instruments. The executioner walked him through the chamber, explaining the function of the thumb screws, the rack, and the iron boots. They hoped the sight of the steel would break his silence. But Niers was a veteran of the mercenary wars. He had seen far worse on the battlefield. He looked at the tools with a cold, detached curiosity, as if he were looking at the tools of a fellow craftsman. On the second day, the questioning under pain began in earnest. As the joints of his shoulders were stretched and the iron was applied,
The psychological armor Niers had built around himself finally began to crack. He didn't just confess to the murders the town suspected. He began to pour out a litany of blood that surpassed anyone's darkest imaginings. He spoke with a terrifying clinical precision. He didn't describe his victims as people, but as units or acquisitions. It was here that the final tally emerged: 520. The scribe's quills scratched frantically against the parchment as Niers recounted the locations. He spoke of the killing fields near the Danube, the ravines in the Black Forest where he had stacked bodies like cordwood, and the lonely mountain passes where he had ambushed entire families. He detailed the murders of 24 pregnant women, explaining with chilling calm how he had used their unborn children for his hand of glory rituals. He told the officials that he had eaten the hearts of these infants, believing it gave him the power to change his shape or become as light as a feather to escape his pursuers. The officials in the room were hardened men, used to the brutal justice of the 16th century, but Niers' testimony made them physically ill. Some had to leave the room to vomit, others crossed themselves and prayed. Niers, however, seemed to find a strange sort of pride in his work. He corrected the scribes on specific dates and locations, ensuring that his record was accurate. He wasn't a man seeking forgiveness, he was an artist describing his masterpiece. He even expressed a perverse frustration that his magic had failed him at the bathhouse, blaming the innkeeper for polluting his satchel with common hands. As the days of interrogation stretched on, the news of his confession spread. Neumarkt became a city under siege by its own grief. People from surrounding villages flocked to the town square, hoping for news of missing loved ones. The records of the trial, which still exist today in the archives of Nuremberg, depict a man who had completely severed his connection to humanity. He didn't kill for gold, though he took it, and he didn't kill for revenge. He killed because he had come to believe that the act of taking life was the only thing that made him real. By the end of the week, the interrogation was complete. The Black Forest butcher had been unmasked, and his crimes were laid bare in a document that would haunt the German territories for generations. The trial was a mere formality. Under the laws of the empire, there was only one possible sentence for a man who had claimed 520 lives. But the judges decided that a simple execution was too merciful. They needed a spectacle that would purge the land of the evil Niers had brought into it. They prepared for a 3-day journey into the heart of justice.
Chapter 6. The Grimoire of the Damned. To truly grasp why Peter Niers was able to maintain his reign of terror for nearly a decade, we must look beyond his military skill and into the superstitions that governed the 16th century mind. In the 1580s, the line between science, religion, and magic was not just blurred, it was non-existent. The same peasants who prayed to the Virgin Mary for a good harvest also believed that a witch could sour their milk, or that a traveler could carry a hex in his shadow. Peter Niers didn't just live in this world, he exploited it. During his interrogation, Niers spoke at length about a set of instructions he followed. He wasn't just a random killer, he considered himself an apprentice to the dark. He believed in the concept of physical transmutation. In his mind, the human body was a vessel of alchemical ingredients. He described a belief system where the skin of a murderer could be tanned into a belt of invisibility, and where the fat rendered from a human being could be used to create witch's ointment.
This brings us to the most gruesome aspect of his methodology, the candles of the unborn. Niers confessed to believing that if he fashioned candles from the rendered fat of infants and lit them while committing a crime, the magical light would paralyze anyone who saw it. In the darkness of a 16th-century home, lit only by the hearth, the appearance of a man carrying a flickering candle made of human remains would have been a psychological weapon of absolute power. The victims wouldn't just be afraid, they would be convinced they were facing a supernatural force they could not resist. But where did Niers get these ideas? Historians point to the True Relation pamphlets of the time, early forms of sensationalist journalism that blended news with folklore. These pamphlets often described the powers of criminals in such detail that they inadvertently served as how-to guides for men like Niers. He was a product of his media. He took the campfire stories of his Landsknecht days and treated them as a blueprint for godhood. He also spoke of his familiar, a large black dog that many witnesses had reported seeing with him. In the folklore of the Danube, a black dog was often seen as a manifestation of the devil or a guardian spirit. Niers used this to his advantage. He trained his dog to act as a silent sentry, low in the brush to alert him if a patrol was approaching. To a peasant hiding in a ditch, the sight of a massive, silent dog emerging from the mist before the butcher appeared was confirmation enough. Peter Niers was not a man, but a demon in human skin. Niers' belief in his own invulnerability reached its peak in 1580. He began to carry a bag of charms that he believed would protect him even from lead bullets and sharpened steel. This bag, which would eventually lead to his capture in Neumarkt, contained dried hearts, fingers, and pieces of parchment inscribed with the names of his victims. He believed that by carrying these tokens, he owned the souls of the people he had killed, and their strength was added to his own. It was a cycle of death that fueled his arrogance, leading him to believe he could finally walk into a town like Neumarkt and be treated as an honored guest. The tragedy is that the very superstitions that Niers used to terrify his victims were the same ones that allowed him to hide. The local authorities were often too afraid to search the haunted parts of the forest where Niers made his camps. They believed that to enter his domain was to risk their own souls. It was only when Niers' human arrogance finally outweighed his magical caution that the iron bars of a cell finally replaced the canopy of the forest. In the next chapter, we will pull back from the abstract rituals and look at the faces of the lost. We will explore the ledger of the damned, the specific victims whose disappearances finally turned the local fear into an imperial manhunt.
Chapter 7. The Ledger of the Damned. While the rituals of Peter Niers were the stuff of nightmares, we must never lose sight of the fact that his 520 victims were not mere statistics. They were sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers. To reach a body count of that magnitude, Niers had to be more than just a ghost. He had to be a tireless engine of destruction. In this chapter, we step away from the abstract shadow of the butcher and look into the eyes of those he hunted. In the late 1570s, the disappearances reached such a frequency that the local economy of the Danube Valley began to stutter. The records from the time show a desperate trail of letters sent between village mayors, One such letter, dated May 1578, speaks of a young woman named Elizabeth, the daughter of a prominent blacksmith in a village near Regensburg. Elizabeth had set out on a clear spring morning to deliver a set of finished horseshoes to a neighboring farm. It was a journey of less than 3 miles, along a path she had walked since she was a child. She never arrived. The blacksmith and his sons spent 3 days scouring the woods. They found her basket overturned and her shawl caught on a bramble, but there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no footprints other than her own. This was the hallmark of a Niers abduction. He didn't just kill, he removed people. He would wait until his victim was in a dead zone of the forest, then use his mercenary speed to overpower them before a single cry could be let out. In his later confession, Niers admitted to targeting Elizabeth not for gold, but because she fit the specific profile for his alchemical candles. Then there was the case of the traveling merchant, Johann. Unlike many of the poor peasants, Johann traveled with a heavy flintlock and a massive hunting hound. He was a man who knew the dangers of the road and took every precaution. In the summer of 1579, he was found in a ravine, his throat cut with such precision that it suggested a professional soldier's work. His horse and his gold were gone, but the true horror was the state of his hunting dog. The beast had been killed with a single, massive blow to the skull, suggesting that Niers possessed a terrifying physical strength that matched his cunning. Niers didn't just target the weak, he targeted the prepared to prove his own superiority. He viewed every successful kill of an armed man as a validation of his magical armor. During his trial, he spoke of these encounters with a chilling lack of empathy. To him, Johann wasn't a man, he was a test of the steel. The psychological toll on the survivors was perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy. Entire families were wiped out in a single afternoon. In one documented instance, a wagon carrying 5 people, a grandmother, 2 parents, and 2 small children, was found abandoned. The horses were still hitched to the wagon, grazing calmly on the grass by the road. The passengers were simply gone. It would be years before their remains were found in a hidden cave, arranged in a ritualistic circle that Niers believed would ground his power to the earth. As we continue to explore the faces in Niers' ledger and move toward the final justice that awaited him in Newmarket, I have a small favor to ask. If you're finding this investigation into history's darkest corners compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me dig up these forgotten cases and keep the lights on while we explore the dark. Now, let's return to the path of the butcher. By 1580, the ledger of the damned was no longer a secret. The sheer volume of missing persons forced the regional lords to create blood lists, the first historical precursors to modern missing persons databases. Every town square featured a board where the names of the vanished were carved. It was a physical manifestation of a society in mourning. The fear was so absolute that it changed the architecture of the region. New houses were built with fewer windows, and the windows they did have were small and barred. Peter Niers had succeeded in turning the heart of the Holy Roman Empire into a prison of its own making. He was the warden of the woods, and every name added to the ledger was a brick in the wall of his legend. But even a warden can become trapped by his own walls. As the list of victims grew, so did the list of people who were hunting him. The families of the blacksmith, the merchant, and the wagon travelers were no longer just afraid. They were vengeful. And as Niers would soon discover, a town fueled by 520 grievances is a force that no hand of glory can hold back. Chapter 8. The Politics of Blood. To modern ears, the idea that a man could kill over 500 people across a decade without being caught sounds like a failure of impossible proportions. We live in an age of satellites, DNA sequencing, and interconnected digital databases. But in 1580, the world ended at the city gates. To understand how Peter Niers thrived, we must look at the fractured, bleeding heart of the Holy Roman Empire's legal system. A system so broken, it practically served as a shield for the butcher. The empire was not a unified nation. It was a dizzying patchwork of over 300 sovereign entities. You had prince-bishoprics ruled by the church, duchies ruled by old nobility, and free imperial cities that answered only to the emperor. Each had its own laws, its own small band of watchmen, and, most importantly, its own pride. If Niers committed a murder in the territory of the Bishop of Regensburg and then walked just 5 miles west, he entered the jurisdiction of the Duke of Bavaria. The Regensburg guards had no legal right to cross that border. To do so was considered an act of war. There was no all-points bulletin. There was no shared intelligence. If a guard in one town found a body, he rarely sent a messenger to the next town to warn them. In the eyes of the law, a crime that happened over there was someone else's problem. Niers, with his mercenary background, understood this politics of blood perfectly. He moved along the borders of these territories like a needle threading a cloth. He would strike in one jurisdiction and sleep in another. He exploited the bureaucracy of the age. While the lords and bishops were arguing over who was responsible for the safety of the roads, Niers was busy adding to his tally. However, by 1580, the sheer scale of the slaughter became impossible to ignore. The blood lists we discussed in the previous chapter had reached the desks of the high nobility. Trade was the lifeblood of the empire, and dead merchants pay no taxes. The financial toll of Niers' spree finally did what the moral toll could not. It forced the authorities to coordinate. A secret decree was issued from the imperial courts. For the first time, a general hue and cry was raised across borders. This was a significant moment in legal history. It meant that any man, regardless of his status or location, was authorized and required to apprehend Peter Niers. The description of the man with the satchel was sent to every innkeeper and bathhouse manager in the Danube Valley. The emperor himself, Rudolf II, was a man famously obsessed with the occult and the macabre. When reports reached his court in Prague about a man using hand of glory rituals to commit hundreds of murders, the case took on a new, darker significance. To the emperor, Niers wasn't just a criminal. He was a spiritual pollutant. The hunt was no longer just about law and order. It was a crusade to purge a human demon from the earth. As we see the net
finally begin to tighten around the Black Forest butcher, I have a small favor to ask. If you're finding this investigation into history's darkest corners compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me dig up these forgotten cases and keep the lights on while we explore the dark. Now, let's return to the final, desperate days of Peter Niers. Niers began to feel the change in the air. The roads were no longer empty. They were patrolled by bloodhounds, specialized trackers hired by the nobility. The taverns were no longer safe places to overhear gossip. They were filled with suspicious eyes. His magic, which he had relied on for so long, felt heavy and sluggish. He was a master of the woods, but even the woods were becoming small. He was being squeezed toward the center, toward the town of Neumarkt. The fragmented politics that had protected him for 9 years were finally uniting against him. He was a lone man standing against the collective will of an empire that had finally decided he had spilled enough blood. He didn't know it yet, but every step he took toward Neumarkt was a step toward the rack, the wheel, and the end of his dark legend.
Chapter 9. The Psychology of the Wolf. To look at Peter Niers simply as a monster or a demon is to do a disservice to the complexity of human darkness. While his contemporaries believed he was fueled by pacts with the devil, modern criminal profiling allows us to look into the mind of the Black Forest butcher through a more clinical, yet equally chilling lens. If we were to analyze Niers today, he would not be seen as a supernatural entity, but as one of the most prolific and organized serial killers to ever walk the earth. Niers fits the classic profile of a power control-oriented killer. For someone born into the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, a shepherd whose life was dictated by the seasons and the whims of landowners, the act of murder was likely his first taste of true agency. In the 16th century, a peasant had no voice, but a killer? A killer held the power of life and death over a merchant, a knight, or a priest. Every life Niers took was a way of elevating himself above a society that had rejected him. Niers was an organized killer in the extreme. He didn't kill in fits of rage or impulsive bursts of violence. His crimes were characterized by meticulous planning, tactical patience, and a high degree of forensic awareness for his time. He utilized his mercenary training to ensure that his crime scenes left no witnesses and minimal evidence. He chose his disposal sites with the care of an engineer, ensuring that bodies would not be found until long after the trail had gone cold. This level of organization suggests a man who was deeply egocentric. He didn't feel guilt or conflict about his actions. Rather, he saw them as a logical and necessary part of his identity. Then, there is the element of magical thinking. Niers' obsession with the hand of glory and the consumption of infant hearts suggests a profound psychological dissociation. In modern terms, he likely suffered from a form of malignant narcissism combined with a delusional belief system. He didn't just want to be invisible. He convinced himself he was. This type of delusion often acts as a coping mechanism for serial killers, allowing them to justify their horrific acts as part of a higher purpose or a sacred ritual. To Niers, he wasn't a murderer. He was an alchemist. We also see the signs of de-escalation and hubris. As a serial killer progresses, they often become more reckless. The cooling-off periods between kills get shorter, and the risks they take get larger. This is exactly what we see in the final 2 years of Niers' life. He moved from the safety of the deep wilderness into towns. He began to frequent taverns. He allowed his trophy bag to be handled by a stranger. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a subconscious desire to be recognized. Most serial killers eventually want the world to know what they have done. They want the credit for their work. Niers' decision to walk into Neumarkt was a silent scream for the world to finally look at the monster it had created. As we move toward the final chapters where we witness the brutal end of this human wolf, I have a small favor to ask. If you're finding this investigation into history's darkest corners compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me dig up these forgotten cases and keep the lights on while we explore the dark. Now, let's return to the dungeon of Neumarkt, where the wolf was finally caged. Niers' psychology was also a reflection of the mercenary mindset of the 1500s. He lived in an era of dehumanized violence, where the sight of a burning village was a common Tuesday. To Niers, the transition from a soldier killing for a king to a murderer killing for himself was a small step. He took the tools of war, the dagger, the ambush, the psychological terror, and turned them into a private enterprise. He was a predator produced by a predatory age. But as he sat in that cold cell in 1581, the magic of his psychology began to unravel. Without the forest to hide in, without the rituals to perform, he was forced to confront the reality of his own mortality. He was no longer a god. He was a man about to be broken by the very laws he thought he had transcended. In the next chapter, we will witness the start of that breaking, the first day of an execution so brutal it was meant to echo through eternity. Chapter 10. The 3-Day Reckoning, Day 1. The morning of September 14th, 1581, dawned cold and gray over the town of Neumarkt. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the smoke of 100 cook fires. But there was another feeling in the air, a tension so tight it felt as though the town itself might snap. This was the day the Black Forest butcher would finally face the world he had spent 9 years tearing apart. The authorities had decreed a sentence that was virtually unprecedented in its severity, a 3-day execution. This was not merely about ending a life. It was a ritual of expiation, a public cleansing designed to balance the scales for 520 souls. By dawn, the town square was already packed. People had traveled from as far as Nuremberg and Regensburg, sleeping in their wagons or on the church steps just to witness the end of the man who had haunted their dreams. This was the theater of punishment, the primary way the 16th century state communicated its power. As the heavy iron doors of the dungeon groaned open, a hush fell over the crowd that was more chilling than any scream. Peter Niers was led out, bound to a wooden hurdle, a simple frame used to drag high-profile criminals to their death. He looked remarkably small, stripped of the shadows and the leather satchel that had granted him his magic. But even now, Witnesses noted that he didn't lower his eyes. He looked at the mob with a detached, military coldness, as if he were still scouting a battlefield rather than walking to his grave. The first day of the sentence was dedicated to the tearing. The executioner, a man who occupied the lowest rung of the social ladder but held the power of a dark priest on this day, stood ready with a pair of red-hot iron pincers. As the procession moved through the streets, the executioner would stop at predetermined locations, usually the gates of the town or the doors of a church, and use the glowing irons to tear strips of flesh from Niers' body. The crowd's reaction was a complex mixture of horror and catharsis. For every strip of flesh removed, a name from the blood lists was whispered among the onlookers. This was a physical manifestation of the law of Talio, an eye for an eye, a wound for a wound. Niers, remarkably, remained silent through much of the first hour. His mercenary training and his belief in his own supernatural endurance seemed to hold him together. He was a man who had watched hundreds die. He knew the choreography of pain, and he refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of a plea for mercy. But as the day wore on and the red-hot steel continued its work, the invisible man began to fade. The psychological barrier he had built between himself and the world was being stripped away alongside his skin. He was being reduced to a screaming, bleeding biological reality. By the time the sun began to set on the first day, Niers was a mass of open wounds, but he was still very much alive. This was by design. The executioner was a master of his craft. He knew exactly how much a human body could endure without the heart stopping. The goal was to keep Niers on the threshold of death for as long as possible. As we witness this brutal first step in the final reckoning of the Black Forest Butcher, I have a small favor to ask. If you're finding this investigation into history's darkest corners compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me dig up these forgotten cases and keep the lights on while we explore the dark. Now, let's return to the twilight of Neumarkt as the first day of justice comes to a close. Niers was hauled back to his cell as the bells of the cathedral rang for vespers. He was not given medical attention. He was simply left to rot in the damp dark for another 12 hours, his mind likely replaying the crimes that had brought him to this moment. The townspeople stayed in the square, lighting bonfires and drinking ale, their eyes fixed on the empty stage where the second day would begin. The magic of Peter Niers was dead, replaced by the cold, heavy machinery of the state. The butcher had become the meat, and the 3-day reckoning was only just beginning. Chapter 11. The Oil and the Iron, Day 2. If the first day of Peter Niers' execution was meant to strip away his physical humanity, the second day was designed to penetrate his psychological and spiritual core. On September 15th, 1581, the dawn did not bring the mercy of death, but the continuation of a meticulously planned agony. The town of Neumarkt remained in a state of suspended animation. The shops were closed, the fields were left untended, and the crowd in the town square had grown even larger. They were no longer just observers. They were witnesses to a cosmic rebalancing. Niers was brought out of the dungeon once more. His condition was pitiable. The wounds from the previous day had begun to stiffen and throb in the morning air, but there was no reprieve. The executioner had spent the night preparing a different kind of torment. On the second day, the focus shifted from the tearing of the flesh to the searing of the soul. The central feature of day 2 was the boiling oil. Large iron cauldrons were set over roaring fires in the center of the square. As the oil reached its smoking point, the executioner began a process that was as much a ritual as it was a punishment. Small amounts of the scalding liquid were poured directly into the open wounds created by the pincers the day before. This was a specific type of torment designed to mimic the fires of the hell that the 16th century mind believed awaited a man like Niers. In the eyes of the law, Niers had burned through the social fabric of the empire, and so he would be burned in return. The sound that rose from the platform, a mixture of the hissing oil and the raw, animalistic screams of a man who had finally run out of endurance, echoed off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings. It was during this second day that Niers's psychological grip finally failed him completely. He began to babble. He didn't ask for mercy. Mercy was an alien concept to him, but he began to name his victims again, as if the pain were forcing the ledger of the damned out of his throat in a chaotic, bloody stream. He spoke of the hand of glory and cursed the magic that had abandoned him. To the crowd, this was the ultimate proof that the demon was being exorcised. The invisible man was now the most visible, most vulnerable thing in the world. The executioner also employed the iron boot during the afternoon hours. This was a heavy iron casing placed around the leg and tightened with wedges designed to crush the bone and marrow within. For a man who had used his legs to stalk the forests and evade the law for 9 years, this was a symbolic destruction of his mobility. The limp that had identified him for so long was now being transformed into a permanent, shattered ruin. As we stand on the precipice of the final day, the day when the Black Forest butcher would finally be returned to the earth, I have a small favor to ask. If you're finding this investigation into history's darkest corners compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me dig up these forgotten cases and keep the lights on while we explore the dark. Now, let's return to the square of Newmarket as the sun dips below the horizon on the second day of the reckoning. By evening, Niers was a shell. He was barely conscious, his body a map of charred skin and shattered bone. Yet the executioner ensured he remained alive. A small amount of water and bread was forced into his mouth, not out of kindness, but to sustain him for the final act. The law required that he be conscious for the breaking, for the moment when his life would finally be extinguished. As the bells rang out for the end of the day, a heavy silence settled over Newmarket. The butcher was still breathing, but the world he had created with his daggers and his rituals was already gone. Tomorrow, the wheel would turn for the last time. Chapter 12. The Breaking of the Bone. The morning of September 16th, 1581, arrived with a heavy, oppressive stillness. For 2 days, the town of Newmarket had been the site of a slow-motion unraveling of a human being. The crowd that gathered on this final morning was different from the one that had assembled on the first day. The initial bloodlust and frenzied anger had been replaced by a grim, weary solemnity. They had watched a man be torn and burned, Yet the weight of his 520 victims still hung over the square like a shroud. This was the day of the Great Breaking, the final movement in a symphony of judicial retribution that was intended to echo throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Peter Niers was brought out for the last time. He was no longer the defiant mercenary who had stood tall 2 days prior. He was a ruin of a man, carried to the platform because his legs, crushed by the iron boots, could no longer support his weight. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now glazed with a mixture of shock and the encroaching shadow of death. Yet, the law demanded his total presence. He was strapped to a large wooden cross on the scaffold, his limbs spread wide in a mocking imitation of a crucifix. The primary instrument of this day was the breaking wheel. This was not merely a device for execution, it was a specialized tool for systematic destruction. The wheel, often a heavy, iron-rimmed wagon wheel, was used by the executioner to shatter the major bones of the body one by one. The executioner began at the extremities. With a heavy iron bar, he struck Niers' wrists, then his forearms, then his elbows. Each blow was met with a sickening crack that carried to the furthest corners of the square. The breaking was a slow process. The executioner was careful to avoid the torso and the head in the early stages, as the law required the victim to remain alive and conscious for as long as possible. Niers was being reduced to a state of living pulp. His limbs, now boneless and limp, were woven through the spokes of the wheel. As he was hoisted into the air, perched atop a tall pole, he looked less like a man and more like a broken marionette. This was the ultimate symbolic defeat. The man who claimed to be a ghost, who believed he could walk through walls and outrun justice, was now pinned to the sky, unable to move a single finger. In the final hour of the afternoon, the executioner delivered the coup de grâce, the blow of mercy. The iron bar was brought down across Niers' chest, crushing his ribs and heart. The Black Forest butcher was finally dead. But the ritual was not yet complete. In the 16th century, the soul was only one part of the equation. The body had to be dealt with to ensure the evil could not return. Niers' remains were lowered from the wheel and subjected to quartering. His body was divided into 4 sections, which were then sent to the 4 cardinal directions of the district. One part was hung near the Danube, where he had hunted. Another was placed near the gates of a neighboring city he had terrorized. His head was placed on a pike overlooking the road to Newmarket. This was a literal deconstruction of the monster. He had been torn apart just as he had torn apart the social and moral fabric of the land. As the sun began to set on that 3rd day, a strange thing happened in Newmarket. The bonfires were extinguished. The taverns, which had been boisterous for nights, went quiet. People began to walk home in silence. The butcher was gone, and the 520 souls he had taken were, in some small, horrific way, acknowledged. The air seemed to clear of the metallic scent of blood and oil, leaving only the smell of the coming winter. Peter Niers had entered history as a shadow, but he left it as a warning carved in stone and parchment. The wheel had turned, the iron had fallen, and the invisible man was finally, irrevocably, gone. But while the man was dead, the story of his crimes was only just beginning its long journey through the centuries, carried by the very true relation pamphlets that had inspired his own madness. Chapter 13. The legacy of the ledger. The death of Peter Niers on that September afternoon in 1581 did not end the story. It merely shifted it from the realm of living terror into the realm of history and myth. In the weeks following the execution, the town of Newmarket and the surrounding territories underwent a period of profound psychological adjustment. The shadow that had hung over the Danube for 9 years was gone, but the scars remained. The Ledger of the Damned, the list of 520 victims, became a foundational document for a new era of European law. The case of Peter Niers was a catalyst for the modernization of criminal justice in the Holy Roman Empire. The authorities realized that the fractured, uncoordinated nature of their jurisdictions had been the butcher's greatest ally. In the years following 1581, we see the first tentative steps toward interterritorial cooperation. New blood decrees were enacted, mandating that local watchmen share descriptions of vagrants and suspicious travelers across borders. The hunt for Niers had proven that a single man could hold an empire hostage if the law refused to communicate. Furthermore, the trial records of Peter Niers were reproduced in thousands of copies. This was the dawn of the true relation pamphlets, the 16th century version of true crime media. These woodcut illustrated broadsheets were sold at markets and fairs, detailing Niers' crimes, his rituals, and his end. While these pamphlets served as a warning to potential criminals, they also played a darker role in European folklore. Niers became the boogeyman of the Black Forest. For centuries, the name of the Invisible Man was used by parents to quiet unruly children, turning a historical serial killer into a figure of dark legend. But the most significant legacy of the Peter Niers case is its place in the history of criminal profiling. Niers was one of the first killers to be documented with such clinical detail. The scribes in Newmarket didn't just record his crimes, they recorded his motivations, his superstitions, and his tactical choices. These records allow modern criminologists to see a clear through line from the 16th century to the modern day. Niers reminds us that the serial killer is not a modern phenomenon born of industrialization or television, but a permanent, dark potential within the human condition. A predator that can emerge whenever the structures of society begin to fail. As we reach the conclusion of this long journey into the life and death of the Black Forest butcher, I want to thank you for staying with me. Exploring these depths of history requires a certain amount of fortitude. If you appreciate the deep research and the narrative focus that goes into these scripts, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is the only way I can continue to bring these forgotten, chilling stories to light. Thank you for being a part of this investigation. Peter Niers was a man who believed that by consuming the hearts of the innocent, he could live forever. In a twisted, dark sense, he was right. His name is still spoken 400 years later, but he is remembered not as a god or a ghost, but as a warning. He is the reminder that no matter how deep the forest, how thick the magic, or how slow the law, justice eventually finds its way through the trees. The story of the Butcher of Newmarket ends here, but the lessons of the ledger remain, carved into the very stone of the history we share. Thank you for staying with me through this long, dark journey. Your support is what makes these deep dives possible. Stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next one.